Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, host of the Angelo Robles podcast, the founder at Family Office Association. Today, and I have really looked forward to this one, U.S. National Defense Fellow researching Bitcoin. And I promise you our conversation will be much more encompassing than just that. But listen to a little bit of this stature. Jason, you're too young to be so credentialed here. Jason Lowery, U.S. Space Force, MIT, class of 23, U.S. National Defense Fellow, and as I noted, researching Bitcoin. And I know some of you might be thinking, I don't get that connection. You will get that connection in about 5 or 10 more minutes. Now, many of you know, besides my tremendous interest in investing in crypto, I'm extremely interested in government affairs and global issues. And I have been accused of being someone who's a little bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm always looking for, is there another story behind the story? So I do nudge things along a little bit. Some people would say conspiracy theorist, but I think that's probably a little too strong for me. I do know real conspiracy theorists, and I don't think I'm one of them. First of all, pardon that long intro, Jason. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Angelo.
Explain your research for the Department of Defense, U.S. National Defense, and how does that tie into Bitcoin?
As a U.S. National Defense Fellow, my job is to study the emerging strategic military implication of technology. I'm in a great place to do that here at MIT. I was sent here as an assignment, so my job is to research technology while also getting a master's degree. This will be my second graduate degree. I'm also an astronautical engineer in the Space Force, and I got a master's degree in astronautical engineering from Air Force Institute of Technology. As for why I'm researching the national strategic implications of Bitcoin, we were given pretty free and open range to choose the topic that we wanted to choose. It had to be of some strategic significance. But when I chose this topic a good 7-8 months ago and started the research in earnest, at the time it was a similar situation where people really didn't fully appreciate the strategic military or strategic security implications of cryptocurrency at all, much less Bitcoin specifically. And so I saw something there and I wanted to pull the thread. And it was only after I started that where we started seeing more and more policy makers come out and actually directly call out the strategic security implications of cryptocurrency, to the point where now it's illustrated on the world stage so very clearly with present day military conflicts. And so, but that isn't actually really why I'm doing it. The fundamental reason why is because I feel like I may have a unique perspective that will be valuable to policymakers for them to understand, specifically proof of work consensus protocols, and how the mass adoption of proof of work consensus protocols could disrupt the traditional property defense as a service export that the United States exports. So said differently, as a military person, and one of the number one exports of this country is property defense as a service. Bitcoin and proof of work is a property defense as a service protocol, where the property is this abstract object that we call Bitcoin or coins. And if this becomes globally adopted, if we monetize it, when nations begin to monetize this abstract object called coins, it becomes a no kidding monetized property. And if the function of Bitcoin, of ASICs, of hashing is property defense as a service, then that represents a new entrant of the entire service of property defense as a service, which is, I don't want to say threatening to the United States export. It's just something that policymakers should be aware of. And we should take it seriously beyond just something that like people like to speculate on. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does. And my next couple of questions are going to lead into some context to that. Like I did state pre the interview, if you're a little bit more of the Bitcoin 101, this is probably not going to be the best conversation, but you know what? It throws you into the deep end of the pool and it's an opportunity to learn more very quickly. And you could always learn about the basics, but I don't think you're going to hear too often some of the questions that I'm going to be asking today, assuming we have enough time. What's the most valuable? So I did ask this question to Michael Saylor, by the way, who, as you know, of course, went to MIT. What's the most valuable lesson you've learned at MIT so far? I'm not going to spoil it with what his response was.
Okay. So MIT, what makes MIT different and just so refreshing is the obsession with the pragmatic application of what you learn. So science is great. Learning formal methodologies such as mathematics and physics is great. Unlocking these secrets of the universe is great, but that's not enough. So that's the mens, the Latin word for mind, right? Like being smart is good, but the MIT motto is mens et manus, mind and hand. So take these formal concepts, take these things, these smart people, and actually put it to pragmatic use to build something useful for and beneficial for humanity. So MIT is obsessed with not just learning knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It is obsessed with putting what we learn to use to build a better world, and the core of engineering itself. And so they are obsessed with the so what, like what can you do to benefit humanity with what we're learning? What difficult problems out there exist that we can use this new knowledge to solve? And that's just what I absolutely love about MIT. It forces you to acknowledge the why, the so what of this knowledge. Being smart for the sake of being smart is pointless if you can't use what you learn to actually benefit humanity.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many people I met that were, I'm going to go with the word former members of Mensa, where you have to have a very high IQ. And as I think my audience knows, and like five people have told me, Angelo, it's effectively we sit around playing chess and poker and talking about how smart we are compared to how everyone else is stupid and how 90% of the people effectively get shit done, nothing done. It's just an exercise in the birthright of having high IQ, which is great. I rather have high IQ than low IQ. But if you don't take action and do something with it, which relates a little bit, you were more eloquent, but relates a little bit to Michael Saylor's answer, which basically was, I learned how to think for myself. And some people were a little taken back. Well, Michael, you know, parents spent $1 gazillion back then. You're 4 years at MIT, and that's your one takeaway. That's a hell of a takeaway. Really, truly learning how to think for yourself, would you agree is an incredibly valuable, let's go with skill?
Yes, they really emphasize the importance of thinking for yourself, from thinking from first principles,
Yes.
from not just knowing, and I hope to kind of illustrate some of this in our conversation. First principles of what software actually is, how to boil down technology itself to its core to fully understand it. And then I think one of the most refreshing things about MIT is how they're not pompous, or at least most of them aren't. Very, very humble people. And then like when you walk inside, people are surprised when I take them inside the campus, because it's not like a hoity-toity campus. They deliberately expose the wiring, they expose the plumbing, they expose everything. It looks like you're in a lab all the time. The president is in a, very not fancy office, or in the middle of the hallway, right where with all the undergrads. So there is no hierarchy in status, or at least not that you can see visibly, like you can if you just walk down the street and walk into Harvard or something like that. So it's not fancy. It doesn't look fancy. It's very pragmatic, and that is so refreshing.
No matter what kind of school you go through to K through 12, bachelor's, a master's, an advanced degree, really try to remember that, thinking for yourself and how valuable that is. I know it sounds so simple as a takeaway for all the money and time spent, but if you truly get that right, which most won't, how incredibly valuable that truly is. Now, Jason, I'm going to have to ask you, there is a history of MIT and Bitcoin, and we somewhat know about it through Gensler's history. But if you could talk a little bit about the early origins of Bitcoin, I guess how it was dropped to strategic people at MIT to kind of get the groundswell going. If you could give us a little bit of a history lesson, please.
I mean, I guess it's worth noting that most new technologies originate out of this school. Not originate, but this school has their fingers deep in every new technology chili. So Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, it would be weird to expect that to be any exception. And there is the digital currency initiative here. There's the Bitcoin clubs. There's the blockchain clubs, and MIT has been part of that story since the early days. Gensler, another example. So I guess the first thing I'll just say is you should expect one of the leading communities of technology to be like familiar and have fingers in this cryptocurrency initiative. In terms of like specifically what they do, it's everywhere. Like it's crypto as a whole. It's not very specific just to Bitcoin right now, not from what I have observed. And so actually I'm kind of an outsider. I take a pretty unique perspective, and my research is actually super unique because not only am I strictly focused on proof of work, but I'm not even evaluating the monetary or financial aspects or investigating that part at all. I think I'm the only one of any formal academic institution that is deliberately only considering the security implications of only proof of work. And I believe that if I'm successful, I will be able to illustrate why proof of work is so significant from not only a national strategic security lens, but also from a socio-technical lens for humanity as a whole. Does that answer your question?
It does. We're going to come. I mean, those were some of the easy ones, but we're setting the foundation.
Okay.
I do have a question off the grid.
Okay.
Or not planned in my notes. Just for my own edification and for my audience, you're at an iconic institution of high learning. The vast majority are under 25, some teenagers. What do you say is the percentage of people that own Bitcoin and whatever? I know you're not the biggest fan, but other forms of cryptocurrencies, do you think it's as high as like 80, 90%? I actually think it is.
It's worth noting that the undergraduate class here at MIT is actually smaller than the graduate class. So,
wow.
So I don't know the exact numbers, but there are more graduate degree students here than undergraduate degree students. So it's in terms of like your average age of a student, it's older than a lot of traditional colleges. In terms of like ownership, I think there's probably a higher percentage that own cryptocurrency as a whole rather than just exclusively Bitcoin. And there's certainly, as a whole, more students are interested in cryptocurrency as an industry, from what I've observed, and professors here, than just strictly Bitcoin. But in terms of like who owns it and who doesn't, it's been hit or miss. Like in my class, I would say maybe like my cohort, I would say from what I've talked to, maybe 25% have any type of investment in crypto. But I don't know if that is representative of the total sample set that is all the students here.
I mean, maybe not. I could argue for privacy and security purposes, they may want to keep that kind of to themselves.
Exactly. And it's a kind of an awkward topic to even bring up. Like, do you own it? So what I do is I just make it very clear that like, this is a topic I'm interested in, and then I just let them come to me.
Interesting. So let's dive into really a core foundation with my first question to you, but I think we need to break it down more. Bitcoin utilizes proof of work as a consensus mechanism. Why is this so important compared to the other common one, proof of stake?
Yeah, that right there is the question I hope to answer with the thesis that I slap down on the table and hand out to every one of my employers. So fully understand this, I think it would be beneficial to, in the MIT way, to start from first principles. Mm-hmm. If you'll indulge me, I think that would be a better way to address this question for your audience. Okay. So the first question that people should really be asking themselves, and they frequently don't ask themselves this question, is what is software? What is the technology that is software? How do you describe software? And if you aren't a technologist or you aren't an engineer, this is actually a pretty surprising thing to say. Like, how do you answer this? So let me ask you, you want to try to answer that question? Like, what is software?
No, I'm going to pass.
Okay, exactly. It's like when you actually take a second and think from like a metacognitive standpoint, like what is technology and what is software? It's kind of actually awkward to even address these questions. And so, before we even have this conversation about the difference between proof of work and proof of stake and cryptocurrency in general, I think people miss the fact that they don't even know how to describe software itself from first principles. And that might be one of the main reasons why people get so frequently confused on this topic, especially for people who don't have a very large background in technology and or software. So what is software? Okay, well, first of all, what's a computer? A computer is a discrete state machine. It just stores a 1 or a 0. It's a discrete state, on or off. It's a Boolean state. So that's what a computer does. So all a software does is simply tell the computer, this discrete state machine, what state to be in. So software is a set of instructions that tells a computer what state to be in. And by virtue of that alone, software is technically discrete mathematics. It's a discrete mathematical equation that says, hey, state machine, 1 or 0, be in state 1 or 0. That's it. Like if you boil down from a first principles technological viewpoint of software, it's a set of instructions that tells a discrete state machine what to do, what state to be in. And it is technically a discrete mathematical equation to do that. But that's pretty freaking hard to understand. And humans, especially if they want to write good software that does complex stuff, we don't think like that. We don't intuitively understand discrete mathematics. And so what technologists do, what engineers do, is we find a way to manage the complexity of software by what's called abstraction. So we abstract away details and kind of think of it differently. And so popular abstractions in software are to consider software as a language. So over time, in the 50s, the 60s, engineers stopped thinking about software as discrete mathematics and started coming up with abstractions such as language, such as Python, such as C++, to describe these what is effectively a discrete mathematical equation in a way that people could understand. And so everything that we observe today that we just take for granted, like there's languages like Python and C++, and the languages have for loops and while loops and function calls and objects, and there's containers and there's container engines and there's a cloud, and like all these words that we talk about right now, we talk about like as if this is a thing, but it's not. Like software is only a discrete mathematical equation. It is only and will always only be a set of instructions that tells a discrete state machine what to do. The cloud is not real. Okay. The objects that we use to describe the complexity of software are not real, right? These are just abstractions that humans use to manage the complexity. Does that make sense, Angelo?
Yes.
Okay. So you have to understand that from the very beginning. If you want to understand Bitcoin, if you want to understand cryptocurrency, if you're an investor who has no background in this, we have to step back 70 years or even longer and say, okay, why do all these nerds even talk about these these things? It's not real, quote real. It's like nothing in software is real. Okay. So in this trend of abstracting concepts, just this idea of a function, this idea of a data type, a variable, a string, an integer, like all these things that are just taken for granted, those themselves are also abstractions. It's still just a discrete state machine that tells that just goes into 1 or 0. So one of the ways that we choose to manage the complexity is we abstract software architectures themselves. And the most common way that people describe software architectures is through an abstraction we call object orientation. From a metacognitive perspective, we look at software. The most common thing that people do is look at software and in terms of objects, as if there are objects. And most people, this has been the common practice of how people abstract software for the last 40 years. But it wasn't always like that. That was just chosen by the market as, okay, one of the many different abstractions that we can use to manage the complexity of software. So let's perceive it as objects. And so when we talk about cryptocurrency and this object called coins and these objects called miners and these objects called validators or stakers or these objects called this or that, that is an abstraction. Just like there is no cloud, right? Just like there is no container, there is also no object. It's just a set of instructions that tells a discrete state machine what to do. We just perceive it and discuss it as if this is an object, or as if it's a language, or we legally classify the language as speech. We just do this to manage the complexity. And we have to this is the first principles. This is the think for yourself part of MIT, right? You must understand this before we even begin to approach the complexity of cryptocurrency, because we're getting into some deep philosophical territory once we start talking about proof of work and proof of stake. And most people don't even realize that they have all these baked in assumptions about what software is. They don't even realize that perceiving software as an object is an assumption, is an abstraction. It's one of many different ways to manage the complexity of software or describe it or abstract it. There are other ways, and these have been popular for 70 years to abstract software. You can do functional abstractions of software. So you can describe software only from its functions. Or there's other options like control. You can abstract software strictly from its control. Okay, so why did I just use all that time? Because when you want to understand Bitcoin at the very beginning, or any cryptocurrency, at the very beginning, you have to first understand the implicit assumptions. You are assuming that it's only objects. You don't even know that that is like an assumption. Most people just take it for granted. 2, you must understand that there are other ways that could be equally or better capable of explaining the complexity of the software beyond object-oriented abstractions. You could focus strictly on function, you could focus strictly on control structure, and you can draw out different conceptualizations and different meaning from those abstractions that might be different than object orientation. And so that's a crucial point to make, because unlike physical systems, unlike physical architectures, software can very well be multiple things at once. It can be both an object and a function or a control structure. It is Proteus. It can take shape as a different subroutine runs. It's technically a wholly different system. It's technically a wholly different discrete mathematical equation. And it can have infinite states. It can have infinite complexity, and it can have just blatant design flaws or blatantly good design decisions that are hidden in the integral complexity that is software. So people just don't understand this. They think of software strictly as objects, and then they apply these biases of objects in physical space. Like it's not possible for a piece of software to be 2 different objects at once. Why would you assume that? Why would you just make that assumption? It's not true. That might be true in physical, but it's not in software. Okay. So there are some problems where an object-oriented approach to abstracting the complexity of software makes sense. If the role of the software is to mimic an actual object in 3D space, then object-oriented abstractions make sense. That's why, like, if you're writing a piece of software to check out books, it does make sense to, create an object called book with a variable assigned to it, checked in or checked out, and write software and design your architecture in that way. That makes perfect sense. You're writing an object-oriented abstraction of software to manage what is fundamentally an object-oriented problem set of figuring out where the books are. This is also true for banks. It's also true for banking, keeping account of the entities, these coins, this wealth that is in one person's account versus other person's account. Object-oriented abstractions make sense. It's helpful for us to think of it that way. But remember, that's not the only way you can think of it. And so now we talk about proof of work. Now we talk about proof of stake. And people frame it as a consensus protocol, but the consensus protocol is effectively the same for both options. The consensus protocol is longest chain is valid chain. We just naturally assume that the longest chain is the valid chain. That's the consensus protocol. So what is proof of work then? What is proof of stake? What do they fundamentally do? What is their functional abstractions, or what is the abstraction of both of these different cryptocurrencies, not from an object-oriented point of view, but from a control structure? And that's where it gets very, very, very important. And that's where most people don't understand this because they don't understand security. I understand security. This is my career. This is my profession. I understand how to secure property. That is my job as a military officer, to secure whatever we're trying to secure. And what most people don't realize is security is a control equation. It's a control structure problem. So if you want to understand the security implications of a piece of software, or how secure a piece of software is, then you can't look at it as an object. You have to look at it as a control structure. So what is the control structure abstraction of Bitcoin or of some proof of stake cryptocurrency? And that's the fundamental difference. And so if you pick all this apart, then you realize, well, I guess before we go there, do you have any questions so far?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So your question is, what's the difference between proof of work and proof of stake? And so I just went on a long explanation and told you, we must understand that you have to view this same piece of software through a different lens, through a control structure abstraction rather than an object-oriented abstraction, to fully appreciate the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. Most people, 99% of people, can't even speak to the technological detail of software in the manner that I just did. So obviously they're not going to have a pretty good explanation. And then most people also will go down the object-oriented path of describing, well, you got miners and you got stakers and you got this object and you got that object, and they end up confusing people. And you see that on everywhere, just this gross misunderstanding of these two different security protocols. So if we understand that security is a control structure problem, not a object-oriented problem. So for example, I'm in the Space Force. Why do we have a Space Force? Because we have to control space. We have to control our access to space. Why do you have an Air Force? You have to control your access to the air. Why do you have to control your access to the air? Well, that air is a threat. Like if your adversary can fly a bunch of planes around, you are in a hazardous state. They can bomb you. They can deny you access to your life, liberty, property, whatever you're trying to claim, to whatever you're trying to secure, right? So you have to find a way to impose a control structure over that entity so that they can't denial of service attack you, so that they can't bomb you, so that they can't roll in those tanks. Okay. Does that make sense? Like if the hazard is they might take over my territory, you can trust your neighbor not to do it, or you can implement a control structure over your neighbor to physically stop them or physically countervail them, to control the battle space so that it's not possible. It's the difference between insurance and assurance, right? Insurance is a probability question. What is the probability that my neighbor will roll in with tanks, and how can I mitigate the damage if it happens? Assurance is, what controls do I have to physically stop or countervail them if they do it? And that's security. The latter part is security. The control structures that are in place to stop attackers physically. Okay, so security. How do you secure your access to your digital property, right? This object called a coin that we have monetized. It's spread across this object called a ledger. And there's these objects called something to do with there are some objects that can write that ledger. Does that make sense? This is true for all cryptocurrencies. Okay, so there's an object called a coin. There's an object called ledger, and there's some object that can write that ledger. And so the fundamental question for security is, well, what control structure is in place over that ledger writer to prevent that ledger writing from denying you access to your property? What if that ledger writer just chooses to withhold your valid transactions? You can own a lot of a token. You can own a lot of these so-called coins. But if the object that writes the ledger deliberately withholds all of your coins from the ledger, your valid transactions, you are under denial of service attack. So you are not secure. Okay. So that's really important to understand, because that is fundamentally the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. Is there are two different control structures over the object we know as the ledger writer. The number one security vulnerability of any distributed ledger is how trustworthy is the entity that's writing the ledger? How do you ensure that ledger writer won't turn on its users or denial of service attack valid transactions, valid users? Okay, so there's two approaches to it. There's proof of work and there's proof of stake. Are you familiar with the main difference between those two?
Please explain.
So it's really simple. Is in proof of work, the ledger writer is the one that projects the most power. And in proof of stake, the ledger writer is the one that has the most object of token. So in Ethereum, for example, your top stakers are the ones that have the most Ethereum. And so you trust your top.
Ethereum is proof of work for now.
Right. Yeah. So I basically just ignore anything like the current version of Ethereum, because knowing that in however many months or whatever, they're trying to switch the entire protocol over.
So they say. But
yeah.
Likely that appears will happen, but I don't know if I'd 100% go into that. So basically what you're saying in proof of stake, he who controls the most tokens has the most power.
Writes the ledger. Yeah, the people who hold the tokens.
That could go wrong there.
Yeah, so the people who own the tokens write the ledger, and proof of work, the people who project the most power write the ledger. So that's the fundamental difference between the two.
Okay.
And so then the question is, all right, well, what type of second and third order or system theoretic process analysis can we do on these two different control structures? These are two control structures over the ledger writer. We know that the top risk is denial of service attack against our property, just like it is in physical property. Like your gold isn't useful to you if you can't access your gold. I can think of a couple countries that are on the world stage right now that are realizing your property is only useful insofar as you have access to your property. If you can't access your property, it's certainly not a good monetary property, right? So you need to be able to have unimpeded access to your property in order for it to be a good monetizable property. And so for a conversation such as cryptocurrency, we must fundamentally understand how we are secure against the risk of denial of service attacks, denial of service for our property. Okay, so in proof of work, it's such a simple protocol. It's the same protocol that we've been using for 4 billion years. We meaning life. We meaning 200,000 years of humans. We meaning 6,000 years of agrarian society. So how do traditional humans secure their access to their property? Easy. They physically stop someone from attacking it or denying their access to it.
Right. A fence, or literally physically. You're correct.
Yeah. So just purely from first principles standpoint, why is the United States the United States? Why does the whole world come to consensus that North America is property of the United States?
Explain. Because they would have to come and take it from us.
Ding, ding, ding. So this gets back to the philosophical point, and this is where it gets kind of like taboo, especially on Twitter. we have to like, people don't understand the actual role of military. They just forget it. The reason why the United States, this land, North America, belongs to the United States is because of all the graves that I can come show you. We can come visit and look at in Boston, of all the Revolutionary War people who died, and all the redcoats too who died, to establish consensus that the North America belongs to the United States, right? Or go back further. How many Native Americans died when the Europeans colonized this land and changed its ownership, the consensus on who owns this land, from Native Americans to the Eurasian people that colonized this place? Or go back even further than that. Why does it belong to Homo sapiens and not Neanderthal or Homo erectus? Mm-hmm. Okay. It wasn't a pretty, it wasn't pretty 40,000 years ago, 200 to 40,000 years ago. We, Homo sapiens, slaughtered all of our humanoid species. And that's why humans own these lands. But it's not even just humans. Like, if you wanted to know, like, let's say do you have a dog? I don't have a dog, but I know.
You probably heard a barking in the background.
Yeah, I heard. Okay. So let's say your dog's like sitting on the couch and there's something on the ground, 2 toys. Maybe a stranger picks up one toy. Your dog looks at it and says, well, and it just like is indifferent. Okay. Stranger picks up the other toy. Your dog starts growling at him. Which toy do you think the dog thinks it owns?
One where it's growling.
Right. It's the physical manifestation. It's the power that the dog is projecting to defend its access to that toy, which defines its ownership from a first principles perspective. What the law says that dog owns is meaningless. Dog doesn't even understand law, doesn't understand human language.
Right.
Every animal yeah. So like if you throw a juicy steak down in front of a pack of wolves, whose steak does that belong to?
The strongest one that takes it.
So
what you're saying from a military perspective is we could have borders and laws and regulations. The reality is, without a military or a system to protect it, it's subject to going back to how humans have done things for a long time. Whoever is the biggest, the strongest, the meanest that wants to take that level of action. So we haven't really evolved too much in all this time, have we?
My argument is, hasn't changed. It's always been true. Your law only exists because of the military that fought to establish that rule of law. That contract only exists because of the baked in physical security. Okay. There are places in the world right now where if you own a house, especially in the Eastern Ukrainian area, right, your claim to ownership of that house as a Ukrainian might not, I don't know how successful that's going to be, right? So it's always been true. Ownership itself is proof of work. It is your life, your liberty, the things you believe in, the property that you think you own. You only have access to those things insofar as you can project power to defend your access to those things, to stop attackers, to countervail attackers. It is fundamentally, from a naturalist perspective, the only way to achieve zero trust and egalitarian control over property. Animals established this from the very beginning as a single-celled organisms. It was just a bloodbath of single-celled organisms fighting over territory, fighting over resources, a subset of which is property. From animals to humans to agrarian society. Yeah, your nice, pretty, pristine, irrigated land is great. If you don't do anything to defend your access to it, you create a giant honeypot. It is in your neighbor's best interest to invade and to take that land. And so these countries, these abstractions of objects that we call countries, only exist because of the power that they projected to define themselves as that thing. And so history itself, what is history? Then simply a decentralized set of entities projecting power against each other to preserve zero trust and egalitarian control over what they want to claim they own. That it is a ledger. History is a ledger written by the power projectors. If you don't believe me, go talk to a Native American and ask them if they agree that North America belongs to the United States or any other.
The word decentralized, do you define that as no single point of failure?
I define that as there is not a one country. There are 280 or whatever, how many countries. Does that make sense? So of all the different entities that are the pools of power projectors that are competing against each other in this power competition to preserve zero trust and egalitarian access over property, because you sure as hell can't trust your neighbor not to invade you. Like, you're not going to make it if you think that. Just read history. So the only way to so in lieu of, okay, let me back up. You have a pristine plot of land. It's 6,000 years ago. You've figured out how to irrigate land and you're growing crops. You're in the middle of the Eurasian continent. You're surrounded by all these predators called Homo sapiens that just systemically exterminated, all humanoid competitors and hunted down to the point of extinction multiple large mammals. Like, these are brutal predators. So you, as a Homo sapien, need to defend your irrigated land against all these other predator Homo sapiens. How do you do it? You've got three options. Option number one is you just trust those predators not to take your stuff. Okay, that's not a very good security protocol.
No.
Trust isn't a good protocol for security. Zero trust is good for security. Well, how do you achieve zero trust control over property? You got two options. You defend your property yourself. If a sapien comes, if a wolf comes, you snarl, right? You snarl at your sapien. You project power to physically stop them or countervail them from taking over your irrigated land, right? But the problem is, what if your neighbor has like an army of 10,000 people? You're busy farming land. Ain't nobody got time to farm land, irrigate land, and defend it. So you have to hire power projectors to defend your land. Does that make sense? You call those people soldiers.
Trust me.
Yeah. So you call those people soldiers, and their whole job is to project power to physically stop or countervail other people's claim to ownership of your irrigated land, of your society, of your wealth or monetized property, which you want to preserve your access to. So that is zero trust and egalitarian control, because the alternative is you trust your neighbor.
I know it's going to sound to the audience that I'm getting a little bit off track, and it's gotten me in some trouble on Instagram, where I stated that an important aspect of humanity, specifically a man, and that's probably the part that gets me in trouble, is to some degree a capacity for violence. And I don't mean that as harsh as that may sound, but that gets people's attention. But the ability to protect what's theirs within the guidelines of the law at any and all cost. Am I a barbarian for feeling that way?
Different species do it differently. Like, some species, the female is the bigger, stronger one that uses this term called violence. But I've retired. I'm not going to use that term anymore, because it's just people outside of the military have very different understanding of what that means, right, what that word means. And so I'm just not going to use it. So what I'm using instead is, you are literally projecting power. You're a force against mass, right? That's measurable in watts. And you physically stop an attacker or to physically countervail an attacker. That's power projection, fundamentally. Watts. Okay, this hopefully you'll see that I'm laying a foundation to understand proof of work and the watts that are spent to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over digital property. But before we get there, it's just really important for everyone to understand that the fundamental law of nature is you only have access to property insofar as you can project power to defend your access to property.
100%.
It's always been true. That it will always be true. Everything about both evolution and agrarian society, all the organizations that we adopt, especially the nation states, are organizations which exist and specialize to project power to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over territory, over contracts, over money, whatever it is. If it weren't for the military defending your country, that country would not exist. Countries live and die based off of their militaries. Countries survive based off their ability to defend their claim of ownership to whatever they're trying to claim they own. And people forget this. They don't understand security. They don't understand control. They especially don't understand zero trust control, and how the only way to achieve zero trust control is if users preserve the ability for them to physically stop and physically countervail attackers. If you do not have that mechanism, then you implicitly and automatically must trust somebody in the loop not to denial of service attack you of your property. There is no such thing as zero trust and egalitarian control over property without power projection, physical or digital. So not physical, kinetic or digital. So if you have, let's say you have a physical piece of property with mass, like gold, for example. Let's call this gold. How do you establish zero trust and egalitarian control? I mean, you can't rely on contracts because contracts are trust. A contract is you trust your counterparty to not break the deal on the contract. Those are trust-based protocols. Law is another contract. It's a social contract. It's based on trust. Okay, so they're not very good at securing your goal. Like law and contracts aren't nearly as effective at securing your access to your gold as power, as the ability to stop. Like you don't have to trust your neighbor not to take your stuff if you can physically stop them from taking your stuff. Okay, so because that property has mass, we use kinetic power, meaning force against mass. Okay, so this piece of property, this piece of pin, I have a gold coin, I just forgot to bring it. I should have brought it. All right, we establish zero trust and egalitarian control over this mass-based property through kinetic power projection. Because it has mass, you have to use kinetic power projection. You have to use force against mass to protect, to establish the control over this. Okay, so let's go back to this big conversation we had about software. What's the difference between software and mass-based stuff? Well, software has no mass. What is software? Software is only a set of instructions that tells a discrete state machine what to do. Okay. So let's say humans figure out a way to invent digital property. We create a piece of software that establishes an object known as a coin, knowing that it's not really an object. We're just abstracting it as an object. How do you achieve zero trust and egalitarian control over this digital object in a way that is secure, zero trust security? Can you think of any ways?
Well, I'm assuming you're getting to what proof of work is.
Exactly. So you get back to that ledger writer, okay, that person or object. That's the number one threat to denial of service attack of your object that you are monetizing. So what control structure is in place over the ledger writer? If you do it through power, through watts, through joules per second. Remember, first principles, power, like this, a gun, like we physically stop or physically attack kinetic attackers or like mass-based attackers through power. Like you can measure, I used to be a ballistics and blast research engineer. You can measure the power, muzzle velocity off a gun or a bomb in watts. It just so happens that the byproduct of that power projection gain is all the nastiness, is all the bloodshed, the destruction, and all that baked in emotional, like sore subject that we now call violence. But the original use of violence, like the original definition of violence, was just simply to bring force at something. Okay, it's just the byproduct of kinetic power projection is dead people, is destroyed infrastructure. It's a bloody, awful mess. All right, but let's go back to massless property. All right, okay, if you're monetizing a piece of property that doesn't have mass, you don't need kinetic power projection. Interesting. You could use electric power projection, still watts, still joules per second. Okay, but now, so if you couple that to the ledger writing and say the people who project the most power have the ability to write the ledger, then you have reestablished zero trust and egalitarian control over this digital object we call a coin. Why? Because all the users have preserved their ability to physically, in watts, stop the ledger writers from denial of service attacking,
Right.
or countervail them if they try it using a physical protocol. It is watts. So just like the power of every gun, bomb, ship, tank, truck, fighter, jet is measured in watts, and those watts are spent to defend people's ownership and access to property, so too do ASICs project power in watts, measurable in watts. What? To physically stop the ledger writers from denial of service attacking the network, or physically countervail them if they try it. So, there's that popular, I don't remember which famous Latin person said it, but natura non facit saltus. Nature does not make leaps. Okay. If in nature, the only way to achieve zero trust and egalitarian control over mass-based property is through power projection, then it will also be true that in digital property, the only way to achieve zero trust and egalitarian control over digital property is through power projection. If you do not have a mechanism for people to physically stop or countervail attackers using power, then it's not zero trust and egalitarian control. You trust somebody somewhere. And that's the fundamental difference between proof of work and proof of stake, because in proof of stake, you necessarily, because the users are literally powerless, they are literally powerless to stop or countervail the top stakers. They necessarily and implicitly must trust those top stakers not to denial of service attack the network. There is no way to stop them or countervail them if they collude. There's no way to even see if they are colluding.
Right.
In proof of work, you can see these giant mining farms, right? Like if someone, like, ain't no one hiding a 51% attack. Like you're going to see a big old heat signature that you can put a tomahawk on.
Yeah.
I'm the military guy, remember? Yeah. So like you can
Yes.
physically see the attackers, you can physically stop them, or you can out hash them. So there's two mechanisms to achieve zero trust and egalitarian control over proof of work. And proof of stake, all these top stakers are probably already colluding. There's no way to prove they're not. They could very well have 70% stake already. You don't know. There's no physical footprint. Okay, what happens if they collude? What happens if they start tactically, very specifically choosing to withhold valid transactions from users they don't like at specific critical times? Sound familiar? What happens if an organization chooses to basically not allow transactions at crucial times, particularly during military conflict, right? This is the difference. And it's as simple as that. As long as people choose to secure their property over proof of stake, they are, without even realizing it, trusting top stakers. And those top staker, and they'll, people will quibble and they'll say, well, the probability that the top stakers might not, but they don't realize that probability is a reliability metric. They're implicitly and tacitly admitting reliance on top stakers, a reliance that proof of work doesn't have, because all users are free and empowered to physically stop or countervail the ledger writers. Or they'll say, well, I mean, even if they have like 75% stake, the other 25% will be able to get some of those transactions through. But it's still a denial of service attack. They're just saying, well, we can survive under attack. But it's like, that's a terrible security strategy.
I mean, what I will say from your perspective, from a security perspective, and my limited knowledge, of course, you're 100% right relative to proof of work. The vast majority of people broadly active in crypto, including significant family offices, they absolutely should know about this. But to some degree, they're in it for the money and the opportunity and all that's happening in the world of crypto. Yeah. There is probably more asymmetrical opportunity in non-Bitcoin investment relative to the size of Bitcoin. We could argue that. Bitcoin, of course, is one of my holdings, but Unlike you, I wouldn't definitely not define me as a maximalist. I guess I may stand out a little bit in Miami this week, but I have great respect for Bitcoin and proof of work. Let's slightly change the direction, but I said only slightly. There appears to be powerful forces at work spreading FUD and looking to constantly pound Bitcoin, and for now, technically Ethereum, as proof of work uses a massive, massive amount of electricity. I believe clothes dryers here in the US as a collective use more electricity than Bitcoin, but that's my little snide comment. Proof of stake uses much, much, much electricity. Where's the truth? And where does it get a little murky and somewhere in between?
Okay. So you measure the power of electricity in watts. Okay. You can measure the energy too in joules, but if you measure that energy spent per unit time, you get watts. That's how most people measure it. All right. So, okay. So let's do an apples to apples comparison. There's existing physical mass-based property. It might be water, it might be land, it might be gold, or some other type of monetizable assets like the contract that's imposed by the rule of law that's defended. How much power in watts is used to preserve zero trust and egalitarian control and to defend users' access to their physical property? Do you know?
No.
No one knows. It's a hell of a lot, though, right? Because
I would say so.
Right? How much of a waste is it when my friends die on the battlefield or other people from other countries? Actually, how much blood has been shed in the history of agrarian society to defend people's access to their property? How wasteful has that been? Okay, because like the human being, they would put out like 100 watts on average. Like like if I'm on my bike, maybe if I'm in the heat of battle and I'm running and just like adrenaline pumped, I might be able to output like maybe 100 or like 1,000 watts, like tops. Maybe not me, but maybe someone stronger. Talk to an army dude or a Marine. Maybe not the Space Force guy. But point is, we spend watts, and when we take a bullet to the face and we die and our blood is splattered all over the ground, that is waste. Okay, so it is inherently wasteful to fight to defend our access to our property. That is the real waste. And yes, it is also wasteful to burn electricity, to burn watts, to defend zero trust and egalitarian access to digital property. But what's the apples to apples comparison? Okay, so this big old ESG attack vector really pisses me off as a military person, because they're looking at, you just compare.
Now, some of this is coming from our own government, I might add.
Yeah, I know. Like, remember, I'm doing this for a reason, and I'm sending it up to the top. Yeah. So like, you just compared the power usage of Bitcoin to a hair dryer. Is that an apples to apples comparison?
Clothes dryer, but whatever.
Oh yeah, clothes dryer. Yeah, like, no. Okay, so if you want to understand what's the reference point that you're using to measure what is, quote, a lot of power? Well, look at this technology through its function. Its function is to defend zero trust and egalitarian access to property. Okay, so compare that to the real world, or not real world, to the zero trust and egalitarian control structure that secures our physical property. And that is the heartbeat of every human being that has fought and died to get to the point where North America is the United States, or parts of Europe are whatever countries, right? Everything we claim to own only exists insofar as the bloodshed to establish the state and chain of custody as it exists today.
So you state on your Twitter, real estate, oil, gold, and equities.
Yeah, what if the United States military dissolved tomorrow? How long do you think you're going to own your house?
About a week if I'm lucky.
Okay. Especially with our neighbors building hypersonic missiles. Okay. Right. Like this is like, it like baffles my mind that I even have to have this conversation, because as the military person, this is just something just like, this is just how I see the world. And, I get accused all the time of being a, hammer that looks at this like a nail. And it's like, well, you're a screwdriver that looks like a nail as if it's a screw. Like, remember the conversation about different abstractions. If you want to understand security protocol, understand it as a control structure, and then look at the different amount of energy that is spent to use and establish that control. And in physical mass-based property, a hell of a lot of power is exerted and wasted to establish and preserve zero trust access to what we want to claim we own. And a hell of a lot of bloodshed. So let's not talk about the environmental, like, oh, and by the way, an easy way to make a country less secure is to convince its population to disarm itself.
100%.
So you want to
same on board here.
So an easy way to get a military to disarm itself is to say that it's too unfriendly to the environment. That carrier battle group uses,
exactly,
right?
And so pacify the
right?
the populace, I guess you could say.
Or think about how ridiculous it is to say that your military is too powerful. It spends too much energy per unit time in joules per second, aka watts. So how stupid does it sound to criticize an army for being too powerful when that is the point of the freaking army, right?
I'm scatterbrained by nature, but I'm jumping around to some of my other questions that tie in what you just said. You probably have to be a little careful how you answer this one. Whatever the IMF, the World Economic Forum, central banks around the world, they have their own motives to what they want to see and what they want to have accomplished. They would love to see a populace that is one global order, one currency. Let's all put down our weapons. It's the trust. That's, I'm sorry, that sounds great. That will never work. It definitely isn't working now. And I would just, now, yes, I admit I wear that I'm a libertarian on my sleeve. I don't try to hide around it. And that's probably why I get strikes on my channel and all sorts of stuff like that. That's how I feel that there are powerful, very powerful forces at work spreading FUD, a lot of misinformation, and effectively pacifying men and really everyone from a societal perspective. And this concerns me long term. Sorry, I got very off topic there, Jason.
Just a couple comments. So I'm not allowed to speak by law. I'm not allowed to say anything bad about public officials, but that doesn't include banks. So I'll bash banks all day long. Banks are proof of stake intermediaries. Okay, you must trust your bank not to denial of service attack you. Okay, so they're a giant proof of stake system, and obviously they're going to be, obviously they're threatened by a proof of work, an alternative intermediary system that reestablishes zero trust and egalitarian control, or more importantly, that removes their ability to abuse the implicit trust that we bake into using a traditional banking service, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm clearly probably not the only person who understands this. And so you get this, like, we're in this like kind of weird situation here where, yes, the financial intermediaries are going to do whatever they can to discredit proof of work. They're going to use ESG as the attack vector, as we have seen clearly.
And they're going to control politicians because of their political influence and their money.
Yeah,
it's an uphill battle.
I mean, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there are some regulatory capture politicians going on, or policymakers. But like fundamentally, it is proof of stake versus proof of work. And the bankers that are proof of stake, or anything that's proof of stake, is going to use, they all mutually benefit from this narrative that Bitcoin's power usage is bad, or proof of work power usage is bad, because proof of stake is the number one, or proof of work is the number one competitor to proof of stake, regardless of the protocol, whether it be physical property ownership like gold or digital property ownership, at least if my theory is correct. I might be wrong, but I'm just
there are people that are going to try to make Bitcoin, and I know this gets complicated with the nodes and miners and all that, a hybrid, what I would call mechanism, and that would cause you to practically fall on the floor. But like, I would be concerned long term because they're very influential and powerful. Could this happen?
they might be politically powerful, but they ain't joules per second powerful. And so, like as the engineer, when I say power, I'm literally referring to watts. Like if you want to denial of service attack, there's there is a combination. It's not strictly from ASICs. You also have to have, there's like issues with nodal approval and it gets technical, but like at the bottom, at the end of the day, when people say that Bitcoin is too powerful and it should reduce its power or move away from proof of work, from a functional and control abstraction standpoint, they are quite literally saying the people who are defending Bitcoin should disarm themselves or move to a trust-based protocol.
This is, as we explain how that works.
Yeah, so they're going to fight it, but like this always happens with new technology. Especially military, aka proof of work, consensus protocol technology. Anytime a new proof of work technology emerges, the incumbents are going to try to resist it. And if they're stupid, they're going to try to kick it out of their country. So there's two glaring examples of where this failed miserably. When Orban the engineer invented cannons and invented a way to cast iron cylinders, to build cast iron cylinders, fill in one end with gunpowder, fill the other end with a ball. He went to Constantinople and offered to build this for Emperor Constantine XI. Emperor Constantine XI said, I ain't got the money for that. Hard pass. That was a stupid decision, right? So he was thinking that like he's the only side of this equation that gets to vote on who gets to adopt this new power projection property defense protocol. Orban walks over to the Ottomans, hands it to a 19-year-old kid, and within a year, the walls of Constantinople are being shot down by Sultan Mahmud, and Constantine is dead. In his last speech, he's telling his officers, don't worry about this explosion engine technology. That's what they called the cannons. Your swords and your shields are fully sufficient and will protect you. He's wrong. So like you don't get the option not to be impacted. You don't get to unsubscribe from the power projection protocol. You can accept it and you can use it to defend your property, or you can forfeit that to your adversary. So fast forward to the 1800s. Whitehead invents the torpedo. He offers to build the torpedo. He goes to the Royal Navy, most powerful Navy at the time, said, I'll build this torpedo for you. The Royal Navy turns him down. Why? Because it's a threat to the naval hegemony. Why would I invest in this technology that can sink all my ships? Okay. See the logical flaw there? You don't get the option.
Self-preservation is part of it.
Whitehead walks over to the Germans. They build it. Okay. So it's the same stuff. Like humans have invented a new way to defend their access to property through power projection. And we could ban it out of this country, or these idiots could try to, change it. But like the future is people will defend digital property with electric power, regardless of whether it's Bitcoin or if it manifests itself in some other way. This is obviously the trend we're going to go on. And
analog to digital, it's not going to go back to analog. You can't stop the progress. I got a lot of questions. We'll maybe go a little rapid fire around all of that. Should I be concerned as an American citizen relative to what you're saying to the status of our electrical grid?
No, I don't think so. The emergent property of using electric power projection to defend our access to monetizable property is more infrastructure, is people being financially incentivized to find cheaper ways to generate and produce energy. So it's actually awesome, because the alternative power projection game to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over monetizable property is you destroy infrastructure and you kill people. So yeah, like it's like actually quite beautiful.
You mentioned governments making decisions. So technically I would make the assumption that a lot of Bitcoin folk have noted that, well, technically the US can't ban Bitcoin. It's decentralized, it's freedom of speech, it's constitutional. And I do believe theoretically that's correct, but we all know it wouldn't be that hard to say, well, let's slap a 20% annual property tax on it. Let's make it difficult for on and off ramps. The US government could. They appear to be making some quasi-right decisions, but they could mess it up. It seems like much of Europe and even India seems to be stumbling on this.
Yeah, let me put it this way. I think that, for the record, by the way, I forgot to say this. Obviously, everything I say is my point of view and not the DoD's point of view. I'm legally required to say that. So from my point of view, the question is not whether or not the United States chooses to adopt it or not, just like it wasn't whether or not Constantinople chooses to adopt cannons or the Royal Navy chooses to adopt torpedoes. The number one question you should ask yourself is, what are the other countries going to adopt? If other countries who are sitting there watching these elephants fight each other through denial of service attacks of financial networks, they're probably going to say, I want to get out of this grass where the elephants are fighting. They're probably going to think, it might be beneficial for me to store some of my sovereign wealth in a non-national asset class. Or in other words, it might be beneficial for me to adopt electric power projection as a way to preserve my access to my property. And if they decide to do that, that's what matters. Okay, if other countries, if all these third world countries who I've talked to their presidential advisors through my classes here at MIT, if they realize, holy crap, the only way I can preserve access to my sovereign wealth is not through subscribing to these proof of stake financial networks that are just basically one big denial of service attack, then it doesn't matter what the United States thinks. Okay, we can't ban them from adopting this protocol. And so the question is, do you want to stay on top of the future, or do you want to benefit from that? Like if all this sovereign wealth flies out of the USD system and just gets sucked out of the theater, you have two options. You can just let it happen, or you can position yourself on the other side and recapture all the capital as it flies out.
100%. Some of the work that I do with families, I came out with a YouTube video about a week or two ago. Effectively, it's sovereign risk assessment for significant families, a little bit more of a catchy title, disaster prep for billionaires. And that takes me to something that you said earlier. Maybe we should be a little careful about using country names, but we could be generic, but I will mention it. So we all know what happened with the truck drivers up in Canada, where Canada supposedly is one of the most democratic countries in the world. I did say supposedly. And now there was that threat of, well, I mean, we know who you are. We know you have money at this bank. We know you have money on this crypto exchange. We're going to basically do an executive order and freeze that. And that was scary. Could something like that happen here in the US?
This is a vulnerability that all financial systems have. A financial system is just an engineered system. There are 4 major loss events that compromise the security of a financial system. Deny people access to their property, denial of service tax, right? Debase people, surveil people too much. And then the major, scary, big loss event that could happen to a financial system is people exit. The most a financial system is a network. It follows Metcalfe's law.
Right.
So the value of a network increases non-linearly as the number of users increases linearly. So a network, a financial network especially, is more valuable when there's more people. That works both ways. If people exit en masse, then the value of that financial network decreases non-linearly in proportion to the linear leak of users. So any financial system intermediary, if they're smart, if they're thinking about security, about control structure, they'll think to their brains, okay, what we need to make sure that we do not put the system in a hazardous state. We need to make sure that it doesn't surveil, doesn't debase, doesn't deny people access to cause exit. Okay, so then they have to think, well, what are the control structures that are in place to prevent the people who have the power to debase or to denial service or to surveil from doing that to the point where it compromises or it causes people to exit in mass. And so what control structures are in place to prevent that from happening? And what we've seen, not only with Canada, but also in 2008, is that the control structures that are in place are demonstrably ineffective at preventing these intermediaries from putting the system in a hazardous state to lead to these loss events. And that is scary. Why? Because now, for the first time in human history, every person has a digital alternative monetary system that they can go to at virtually zero marginal cost. You can scale out of the current system into this new system at no marginal cost. There's like basically no penalty to exit really quickly, really fast. So with this digital alternative in place, people have the ability to effectively cancel traditional financial systems that has never existed before in the history of agrarian society.
Right.
And so you better damn well be careful and think to yourself as an intermediary that is concerned about the security of your network. What am I doing to prevent putting us in this hazardous state? And these countries, that was just a glaring, stupid decision by those intermediaries that don't understand basics of security. So they disenfranchise users. Those users are going to exit. And now their network, the value of their network will suffer substantially from that. And if they continue it, it's absolutely a problem of the United States network, especially now that we're doing denial of service attacks on a grand scale against entire nations.
I'm assuming it goes without saying, but I'll ask you the stupid question to someone of your knowledge and experience on this. I'm assuming you're a believer, not your keys, not your crypto, leaving it on a public exchange, even theoretically putting it with an institutional provider, which probably is how most family offices do it, would not be the level of security I would assume that you would believe in having your old cold storage wallet.
I trust myself enough to put in the control measures over myself to not do anything stupid. So I personally am a big believer in not your keys, not your coins, and personal custody of your coins. Not everyone is like that though. Like I wouldn't recommend that to someone who is like, 70 years old and doesn't understand software, doesn't understand keys.
Right.
Like for my dad, I just okay, just keep it on the exchange because I feel like, it might actually be safer there than in your hands. So it just, right. It just depends on the user, but the fundamental lesson is control or security is fundamentally about controls and preventing that person from putting the system or the property in a hazardous state. And I believe I can do that more effectively through personal custody of my keys, not through trusting a third party.
To some of the topics that you brought up earlier, it got me thinking a little bit as you were talking. Real estate. I'm talking to you from my home now in a lovely town, at least I think, in Connecticut. What verifies that I really own my home? Like my DNA is not necessarily in the walls. I have a deed. It was specifically set up through a traditional structure of buying real estate, exchanging capital, owning the property through a deed. That goes back to what you said earlier. Without military, without some semblance of consequences, that creates anarchy. Now, could I make the point that deed now or in the future with the advancements of AI and technology and even stock certificates, we don't get those anymore. That's the DTCC, it's ledgered. Could our footprint of physical assets that we believe we truly own be challenged by wiping it from the face of the earth or that deed? I hate to get a little eerie, but things might get ugly.
Go look at regions in the world right now. You can see the before and after pictures of these cities, of these pieces of property. That property only exists insofar as you have a military to defend it. Your deed is irrelevant to the tank that rolls in, right? So your deed, China doesn't give a crap about your deed, Angela. I
know that's basically what I said.
so part of that property is tax. Right? You pay some percent of your property's value in tax, and that tax goes to your military, to my friends. And we ensure that no tanks roll over your property or no hypersonic missiles or nuclear weapons we do what we can to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over this territory so that you can then proceed to believe you own it without ever having
I like the way you phrase that.
without ever having to actually defend it yourself. And don't ever forget it.
Oh, trust me, I don't. It's others that we have to be more concerned about. I am just going to go rapid fire. If you have half an hour, great. If not, we'll just do the best we could.
Yeah,
you may
I'm
not
good.
like my questions. Let's bring it on.
Okay.
I was going to ask about SHA-256, but this will be an indirect way of asking, getting more rapid fire. Was the US government involved in the creation of Bitcoin?
All of the core components of Bitcoin, yes. So to include, and especially SHA-256.
Okay, well, thank you for answering it that way.
But at the time, it's not like, so by the way, most critical enabling technologies of all societies that we use were started in the military. Like your road network is
including the internet, I believe, correct?
To include TCP/IP. To include,
yes.
Yeah. So that's not like, it's not like special, right? To say that the core technology in Bitcoin was established in the military as a military defense network or military defense technology, it's not really that big of a deal, because that's true for like a lot of stuff that we use today. Satcom.
I don't think it's one person, and effectively 3 names seem to always come up. Satoshi, whether a man or a woman, being a collective. Would you have any opinion you would like to share? Obviously, the most common ones would be Hal Finney and others, Nick Szabo, etc.
Satoshi said the word attack 25 times in 8 pages. He was very clearly an adversarial minded thinker. He was very clearly aware of emerging technology that came out of the NSA. And he was very clear at OPSEC and knew OPSEC, importantly. So I'll let you make your own decisions, but like,
do you have any opinion? And this goes back to the 60s, as I believe a CIA operation in Switzerland creating crypto AG. Any opinion about that?
No, not really. I mean, crypto in general has been like a military pursuit for like thousands of years. So that's another thing. It's just like, okay, that's always been true. Like cryptology itself, how to disguise messages and to secure messages, especially for the military, is just like, that's our bread and butter and has been since long before there was even a United States. So to me, it's just like, whatever.
Does a 3-letter agency, whichever one you want to choose, control some Bitcoin exit nodes?
Not that I've seen.
Okay.
But I wish they would, and that's part of my. I wish someone in this country would, and that's part of my thesis. Remember who I am and who I work for. Like,
I'm distrusting of central banks. They obviously want to push towards central bank digital currencies. My audience has heard me speak so much about how your privacy goes completely out the window. And I mean completely out the window, at least in the way that I know it. It seems like we're going to be trying that here. You're going to hear some of my stuff maybe a little later if we have time. Is there any way this is not inevitable?
So to answer this question, we back up again. Natura non facit saltus. There is no such thing as zero trust and egalitarian access to property without power projection. It's been true for 4 billion years. Every animal has figured this out. Agrarian society has reinvented the same protocol that existed before there were even brains. So the question is fundamentally, is there any reason to believe that would change? If we created digital property, if we use software to form an object that we monetize called a coin or a token, why would there be any reason that we would expect that anything other than power projection would be the way to achieve zero trust and egalitarian control? Now, would it be Bitcoin? I don't know. But at the end of the day, how would you know what is the protocol? Well, it would simply be the one that the most people use. So if we already have nation states already choosing to use state money to run Bitcoin ASICs to make sure that they preserve their zero trust and egalitarian control over property, and then more countries do it, and then more nations do it, and this network continues to grow and continues to grow, then the supplement to war, the supplement to using power projection, whether kinetic or electrical, but this in this case specifically, humans choosing to use electric power projection to defend their access to digital property. The predominant protocol is simply the one that the most people adopt, and that's already Bitcoin, and nothing comes even close to comparing to the amount of people that have adopted that protocol. So will it change? I don't know, but it's going to be whatever it changes into, it's still going to be an electric power projection game. Else you have to trust an intermediary not to denial service attack you.
I asked it, but this is probably a little more direct for some people. The dollar is protected by the US government and military. What backs or protects Bitcoin?
So the dollar is protected by the military defending the dollar.
Okay.
that needs to, like, we need to make that really clear. All property, monetized or not, your access to that thing is the power projected to defend your access to that thing. And if you look back to all fiat currencies and you look at, okay, what was the dominant world reserve currency and what was the dominant military, you'll notice a very strong correlation that the most powerful military has the world reserve currency. Why? Because people want their property to be well defended. Okay, so like the value of the currency is the massive amount of military strength that will defend that currency. Okay, if you put all your eggs in some, buying a bunch of, like, imagine if you only, I don't know if like Ukraine has a currency right now, but like, imagine if like you only bought Ukrainian money. It's like that, you would be worried about the value of your money right now. Okay, because so, but that's true for any. And so with Bitcoin, what's happening? It's the same story. Is people are monetizing the thing with the most power to defend it. The only difference is it's not a state. It's not a formal state that's projecting all that power to defend people's user access to that property. It's just a collection of volunteers. But it's still true, the trend over the last several hundred years, that world reserve currency or base layer collateral asset, if another way to, or gold, like you want that correlates to most powerful military. And so if Bitcoin is simply the supplement to military power, instead of kinetic, you have electric, then it's still true that you're monetizing the thing with the most powerful military to defend it. Okay, so your USD would be pointless if it weren't for the military. Go talk to Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson or any of the other founding fathers, if you don't believe me.
Names that I'm sure you're familiar with: Stuart Haber, Scott Stornett, I believe it's pronounced, and who am I leaving out there? There's someone else, David Bay, I believe it is. Going back to 1990, Belcore Labs effectively created maybe what I would define as kind of a blockchain. I probably don't want to make it overly technical because we're going rapid fire, but any opinion on how that led eventually to SHA-256 and Bitcoin?
Distributed ledgers are common. How you choose to partition your distributed ledger are common. Mm-hmm. The object-oriented abstraction that you choose to describe the complexity of a software digital ledger, regardless of how it's partitioned, is common. So if you want to call it a chain of blocks, that's fine. Okay, it's not hard. That's not special. But like if you back up, what is history? History is a ledger. History is a ledger that tells people what the state and chain of custody of ownership of territory was over time. Mm-hmm. And it's a distributed ledger because different people have different copies of that history. That's why China recognizes France. That area of Eurasia is called France. This area of Southwest Asia is called India. This area of Africa is called Egypt. Okay, we all share these distributed ledgers, but in this case, a physical ledger, and it's partitioned, and it's basically partitioned per battle across time. Like, okay, now this doesn't belong to the United Kingdom anymore, or King George, it belongs to these American Why? Because they killed all those redcoats, not because they signed a Declaration of Independence. It's because we achieved it through power projection. So that's my thoughts. It's like, okay, cool, ledgers, great, totally common. The real core is not the block, like the real value of blockchain. Like that's why I'm not, by the way, I don't consider myself a Bitcoin maximalist. I consider myself a proof of work maximalist. Because you can have different blockchains. It just so happens that Bitcoin is the most widely adopted proof of work system. And another thing too that really bugs me is people forget what the fundamental purpose of a blockchain is. The fundamental purpose of a blockchain is to preserve a record in a hostile or non-permissive environment. That's why you make different copies of it. That's why you decentralize the ledger. Is if that goes down, well, you still got a copy over here. And so I say that because if you create a blockchain technology that requires trust or some intermediary or permission, then you've effectively built a horse-drawn car. You are just you're just using this technology for something that it's not even intended to be used for or special or benefits. So sorry, does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
I mean, you'll know what this is. The audience may need to look it up. Is Saberhagen / founder Monero part of a 3-letter U.S. governmental agency? Part 2, was it Hal Finney?
I don't know about the first. Actually, so for the record, I don't know about any of it. I don't think I would, especially as vocal and public as I am now, I don't think I would be told if it did happen. How I wouldn't be surprised though. Like how are these people so familiar with this military encryption technology so soon after it was publicly released? Maybe it wasn't Hal specifically, maybe it wasn't the Satoshi or, all these other legends, obviously like Adam Back and those people. Right. Maybe, but their adversary are thinkers. They know a lot about this kind of stuff. And who cares if they were? Because they clearly took enormous risk. They clearly saw a need for human beings to defend themselves against an abusive intermediary. And they took the risk and they built something and it's working. And it's like, doesn't matter who they were or who they worked for. Get away from this ad hominem crap and just focus on the technology. And it could have been built by the worst person possible, but like the technology speaks for itself. And by the way, that's the whole point of this technology. Is the whole point of this technology is so we don't have to we bury everything, people's identities, under a pseudonymous layer of random string of letters and numbers, specifically so we don't discriminate or do ad hominem attack against the origin of the technology or the tokens. So like stop. I don't think. But obviously I'm biased. Like I am I get called on Twitter a spook all the time. Like I am in the military. I used to be an intelligence officer. I know this. I know behind the scenes. From my point of view, everything that I have seen is for good. But don't trust me. Don't trust anybody. That's the whole beauty of this technology is regardless of who built it, regardless of how trustworthy they are, you don't have to anymore because you are empowered, literally, physically empowered. You can project power to defend your access to this property.
Should we have any concern as miners fled China, and I'm assuming the US, Pakistan, and other benefactors or beneficiaries, that China still has some level of control over them or their families?
Over like the ASIC people, the hashers?
Yes.
So yeah, maybe. In my opinion, that was the best thing to happen to Bitcoin and to the United States. So in the 1400s,
that's the positive way.
the Chinese merchant ships were like 10 times larger than like Columbus's ship. Like the Chinese could have easily colonized the Americas 100 years or more faster than the Europeans did. They didn't because the Chinese elite were threatened by the emerging merchant class. And so they had the fleets burned. And so they forfeited the next 600 years to the West because then the West could sail their crappy ships and colonize the United States before the Chinese could. All right. And so that was great. And so they did the same thing again. Okay. Once again, they have this amazing power projection protocol. And because they're threatened by the merchant class or a rising power, the elites are threatened by this, they burnt their ships again. They kicked out their power projection industry. And I believe for that reason, they forfeited the future yet again. So now the West is going to colonize Bitcoin. We're going to have the most Bitcoin. We're going to have the most zero trust and egalitarian control structure over Bitcoin. We're going to be the most, our access to our Bitcoin is going to be the most well defended. And so, like, thank God that they were that stupid, because it would have sucked if they weren't stupid. But the problem is they're a very authoritarian country, and this is true for Russia. And now, especially that they're being baited into repricing their exports in a different currency or just exiting the USD financial system altogether, because they're so authoritarian, they do have the means to pivot back into Bitcoin quickly. They could if they wanted to. And through state-sponsored, whatever. And so that's scary. And so we need to, my goal is to make sure that our policymakers understand the national strategic and socio-technical implications of proof of work, so that at the very least, we don't pull a China and burn our merchant ships. But in case China, Russia pivot back, if they figure this out, everything we said about different ways of abstraction software, and this could be a dramatic thing. If they figured it out first, that would be bad. So I don't know if they're targeting their local hash rates. I don't think so. This is just like what China does. Like they banned like playing video games for more than a couple hours a day. So like, this is just what they do.
That's true. I guess it was Donald Rumsfeld who noted something to the effect of there's known knowns and there's unknown unknowns. When you look at sovereign risk and disaster prep for billionaires and all that, in my opinion, it doesn't take much to go wrong besides confiscation through taxation, through bad monetary policy, inflation, the kind of executive order that we saw up in Canada, freezing of centralized resources. I mean, what would happen in the cities? I mean, I do know what will happen in my opinion, but I want to hear yours. Whatever, San Francisco, Seattle, New York, Miami. If 3 days of no electricity, no food supply incoming, and limited water, will we see utter chaos?
I mean, like at a large, like massive scale, no power in certain industries.
Yes, massive scale.
Yeah, that's definitely disruptive and dangerous. Like if you remove people's access to electricity and water and they're unprepared for it, that would be devastating. Not just for any reason, but to civilization as a whole. Yeah, that's definitely a problem. We have the Army Corps of Engineers. We have a lot of military people. So that is a loss event that you're describing. So then the question is, from a security perspective,
it's a bad one.
Yeah. So the security perspective is, okay, who controls the power? How do we control power and water to these places? And then the security question is, what control structure can we put over that to prevent us from being in a hazardous state? And so the answer is, you just don't ever allow us to be in a hazardous state. There's some things in the environment that you can't change. Like if a meteor hits, it's going to be a problem. Or if a nuclear weapon goes off, it's going to be a problem. You're going to have some losses. You can't mitigate that altogether. And so the question of, well, how, like, to me, as the military security guy, to me, the question is not thinking about all the bad implications or how severe the loss event would be. To me, my responsibility is, okay, what control structures can we put in place so that hazardous state never even happens? So like, how do we make sure that we have redundancies, we have different ways to pump water and electricity into it, so that one goes down, the other different ways to port in water, electricity, or to get people out into places with water, electricity in the case that something like that happens. That's what I think about.
I mean, I think, hinted at it earlier. I was asked by a multi-billionaire, we have a compound, it's remote from a city. It's big, it's whatever, solar and food and water. And I'm like, well, others are going to see that and want to take that from you if something were to really, really go wrong. Oh, but I have a loyal, well paid, as if money may mean as much, then security force. Would you agree that the biggest, strongest person in that security force, we know what they could do to the billionaire? And this is an example of chaos, of going back to, again, if there's no, forget law, if there's this no force to be able to protect you, then none of that matters. Who will sit in that throne will be the person who effectively takes that action of being the biggest and the strongest.
Economics is pretty simple. If you have something valuable and you don't defend it, then the return on investment of taking that undefended valuable thing approaches infinity.
Exactly.
So you must defend the valuable thing. And the problem is, especially from a military perspective, is that always looks like waste. So like if you have a really immaculate thing that you're trying to defend, and you know this, the return on investment of attacking it is approaching infinity because you're doing nothing but trusting people not to attack you, then you have to pay money, you have to make an expense, you have to build a military to defend the thing, to tilt the calculus in favor, right? So that you lower the return on investment of attacking the thing. Well, if you're really good at that, like if you build a really good defense, so good that no one even tries to attack your thing,
right,
that will always look like waste because no one's attacking you, right? If your military does nothing but drill and train, but never actually fights because no one's actually trying to deny you access to your property, it will look like waste. That training, all the supplies, everything you're doing to reduce the return on investment of a third party counterparty taking your stuff looks like waste up until the point where the tanks are rolling into your city. And then 100%. You're like, oh, maybe it would have been better to have a giant military training all the time to defend me against the stuff. So that's always that's especially the problem for the top dog, like the United States. Everything we do will always look like waste. That's the dichotomy of security itself.
I might just have 2 or 3 more questions. I do want to be respectful of your time. I'm going to go back to central bank digital currencies. Probably a validator system, and the banks, of course, will want to be the validators. My part 2, and the more important part, why are the Boston Fed, MIT, and others working with the post office on central bank digital currencies, I believe known as Project Hamilton?
Yeah, so you're striking the chord that explains why I don't work with the DCI and why I have an independent advisor. I'm not interested in what the Boston Federal Reserve has to say about my research for obvious reasons. And obviously the intermediaries, the proof of stake intermediaries, are going to want to continue doing proof of stake intermediation, whether it be through central bank digital currencies or through some other measure. And if I were a bank, I would do if I were a bank, I would try to convince people that proof of work is bad for the environment, so that you basically bait people into going into your financial system where they are literally powerless to stop denial of service attacks.
It's going to sound off topic, but you may have an opinion. Is the metaverse something where governments or powers that be look to control our minds?
The metaverse is really just in my opinion, a way of describing how every industry is working on building digital twins of whatever their system is. So a digital entity, object, we can abstract it as, that inputs feedback from the real world and then sends control signals back to the real world. So everybody in every industry is looking for a way to build a digital twin. And if you add that up all together, you have this phenomenon we call the metaverse. So for example, like Google Maps is a metaverse. It is a digital twin of real world roads and stuff. So everyone's trying to do that. when you do that, there's obviously opportunities for anybody, whether it be government or any other institution, to abuse that or do sneaky stuff. I don't know, but like whether or not there's some like actual sponsored mass whatever effort to do it or not, I haven't seen anything like that. But if there were, I would imagine it would be commercially vested interests trying to control people's minds sooner than it would be the government, if that makes sense.
Is effectively the matrix, I mean, maybe you'll say hundreds of years, but is that effectively inevitable?
Neural lattice technology exists. We have to overcome. So a digital twin is, you send it inputs from the real world. We do this through, your fingertips. That's really slow. So we need to find a way to interface with computers through a neural lattice. And so in that world, yeah, you could get it in a situation where you plug something into the back of your head and boom, you're in your VR digital twin environment, and everything else has agreed to have a digital twin so that there is effectively a matrix.
Yes.
I wouldn't be surprised if that feature happens, but I don't think it would be some scenario where the matrix exists to create a metaverse to farm human watts for our AI robot overlords. I think it would just be people will do it to have fun.
My final two questions, I think they're both pretty quick. What would cause you to change your mind about Bitcoin?
If some other network has bigger proof of work, projects more power. Like if Ethereum or countries, any digital currency, any object that we abstract and monetize, if that becomes more widely adopted and the power projection protocol to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over that monetized software object abstraction we call a token becomes more widely adopted by people, by nation states, then that would change my opinion. I would sell my Bitcoin and move to that system. That's why I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist. I'm a proof of work maximalist. I recognize the fundamental role that warfare and power projection plays in our life. And if some other mechanism of projecting power to establish zero trust and egalitarian control over monetary property emerges, and it's more widely accepted, then I'll just go that way. I'll use that as my base layer collateral reserve asset to defend my sovereign wealth and my access to my property.
I mean, I'm asked that too, relative to my disaster prep for the super rich. And sure, there's areas of having diversity and residency and resources, assets, banking, crypto, multiple passports, etc. I wouldn't say it could hurt. We're already on the grid. You might as well be on as many of them as possible and maybe be a little bit deceiving. But like, what would be like the best country to move to? One, there is no one best. I can make an argument for several. And although it sounds like I'm sometimes concerning about how things are trending here in the US, what I see in San Francisco and other things that maybe I'll keep a little more to myself, it's basically worse in other countries. Like, I don't know how much research you've done from that perspective, but it goes back to kind of what you said earlier. The US is a country with an extremely powerful military. We have contract law. We have oceans on both sides, friendly neighbors, a well-armed population. Yeah, there's things I don't like. I really don't like some things, but comparative to what my alternatives would be, Switzerland, maybe in some ways, but any country with nuclear weapons could take that over, or through direct force. They're military, they're a tiny country. I don't know what my question was there, but basically, do you agree?
Yeah, I get this a lot too. Obviously, there's a lot of people that aren't a fan of U.S. military, particularly the ones that don't live in the United States.
Of course.
And so this it really is just like, okay, would you rather live in China? Would you rather live in Russia? Would you rather live in India? Right? Go find a nuclear power somewhere and look at how strong they are, how strong their contract law is, how robust their governance system is, how much they empower their civilians to be able to defend their property themselves, recognizing that power and property rights are married together to include your life as property, your values as property. You're more capable of defending your life and your values if you are afforded power projection apparatuses to do so.
Absolutely.
This was Second Amendment. This was fundamental. Our forefathers understood this because of what they experienced through their having, the bad things that happened when they trusted their monarchy, not to denial service attack them or debase them. And so, like, I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is. I just know I'd rather not live in China or Russia. And what gets really curious is how is it going to work in the future when if most people, and to include nations, subscribe to Bitcoin as the power projection, zero trust, and egalitarian control structure over their sovereign wealth. This is something, I guess maybe this is a good closing. Can I, do you have any more questions? Because I have a good closing comment I could give right here.
That sounds like a great closing comment. I'm trying to keep a straight face on this one, but I feel I have to ask it. Then you could go to your closing comment. Is Daddy Elon a U.S. government agent?
No.
Keep a straight face. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. Elon's awesome. We don't always get along. So like I'm an astronautical engineer, so I have like proprietary access to all launch providers. I'm on like that's a Falcon right there model. Like I know the SpaceX launch systems really well. Elon's not a fan of the government and the way government does stuff, and so he doesn't appear to be like a government insider, and his criticism has improved, especially launch operations. So, but that being said, you have to remember that it is launching is an ITAR, like rockets are a weapon system. It's like a controlled technology with restrictions, and so every rocket doubles as a nuclear ICBM. And we have a Space Force now. Assured access to space is a strategic necessity now. So everything he does, whether it be launching awesome reusable rockets or creating a satellite-based internet system or improving energy production and storage capabilities, these all double as strategic military dual-use technologies that we are going to use. Like, I was at Vandenberg when we bought Starlink before the civilians did. We paid more for it, and Elon was advertising Starlink to the Joint Chiefs before it was built, and obviously you see how Starlink has been used in other military operations. So that trend, you don't have to be working for the government for us to use your technology. Like, he doesn't have to be explicitly building weapon systems for them to double as defensive weapon systems. And people just forget that. They don't realize that like the Space Force doesn't have its own rockets. We have Second Space Launch Squadron that reuses a couple old ICBMs for like small payloads, but those are going away and we have no plans to build more. So we rely exclusively on our commercial industry for this critical national security space lift capability, and we seed them and pay them accordingly. So just like GPS is a weapon system, a Falcon 9 doubles as a critical defense technology, just like any gun or something. It's just different, used differently. Does that make sense?
It does. And
okay.
No question, I left questions on quantum on the floor. We just didn't have time for it. 20 seconds before you go into your close, and then please give your amazing Twitter and any social media. Your stuff is great, and I highly recommend my people to follow it. safety in crypto keys and satellites in the future, or is that potentially more of a risk?
These are fun questions, especially when you get into nation states and how they should secure their keys. From like, we've bounced around ideas. I've talked to them on Twitter, like you put your keys on a nuclear submarine. I think that's probably makes most sense because nuclear armed submarines are like the end of the line. Like the
Yes.
the United States would be destroyed before your nuclear submarine hiding underwater is destroyed. So it's like, and they're probably stronger than if you put them in a satellite. But what if you put a satellite on in cislunar orbit or parked it on the opposite end of the moon with your encryption keys? It's definitely a possibility. And whenever the government finally starts to think about this stuff, sign me up to be the engineer on that team, because I would love to think about this stuff.
Well, I'm glad I asked it. We'll give it more attention next time, but I'll allow you to do your close and how people could learn more about you and follow you.
Yeah, I forgot what was I talking about when I said that? I can think of one off the top if
go for it. It's all yours.
So fundamentally to me, the proof of work is simply humans or life itself finding a way to defend their access to their property or their resources using power projection. You have to use power projection because that's the only way you can get around that pesky thing called trust. We have been using kinetic power projection as an agrarian society for 6,000 years. We've mastered it, but there's a lot of downsides. We talked about them: destroyed infrastructure, dead people, bloodshed. Also, if you go into all this effort to build a military, to build a power projection apparatus, and the person in charge of that military is greedy, they would be tempted to use that power projection to take other people's property and to misabuse other people's rights. And so that's bad. Obviously, that's bad. And so now consider if it, like, maybe I'm wrong and maybe this is all crazy and I'm just like, a hammer actually looking at a nail that's not really a nail. But if I'm right, if the thesis itself is right, that by creating a monetizable digital object that we can call our property, that we can monetize, call our base layer collateral between nation states, and if it's true that you can achieve zero trust and egalitarian control over that monetizable property using electric power projection, consider what that means for humanity as itself. And now consider what that means after the advent of nuclear weapons. And this is why my thesis is going to be called mutually assured preservation. Because if we just assume that I'm right, that this description, this control-based or function-based abstraction of Bitcoin or proof of work is true, think of the socio-technical implications of that. Meaning, consider the fact that we humans mastered this power projection game to the point where we scaled it to where we can't use it anymore. Nuclear war is a war without winners. So if we ever got into a situation where sovereign powers have to preserve their zero trust and egalitarian access over their, let's call it their land, using nuclear weapons, that risks nuclear annihilation for the whole species.
Right.
So nation states, after mastering this power projection game and scaling it up to the nation state level, we took it a little too far, and we actually lost our ability to achieve zero trust and preserve zero trust and egalitarian control over monetary property because it's too expensive to use this protocol now. And that is, in my opinion, why we have nuclear peers, denial of service, attacking each other through their financial networks. We have been forced into this situation where we must subscribe to some nuclear power's monetary protocol, and we must give them the proof of stake security vulnerability of being able to denial of service attack us, because the alternative is nuclear war, and that's a war that no one wants to fight. You would, and so that's a predicament. Like, from a big picture level of society in general, how do we protect ourselves against oppression if we have scaled the kinetic power projection game to a point where we can't use it anymore and we must necessarily trust nuclear powers not to misabuse that trust? That's scary. And what do we incentivize by that? And now consider Bitcoin, right? Like now consider proof of work itself. If it's true that we have created a new monetizable piece of property that preserves zero trust and egalitarian control over this monetizable property, then it's not just an investment. It's not just a different, something to speculate on. It's not just a currency. We have effectively reestablished permissionless control over resources after nuclear stalemating ourselves. We've effectively invented a surrogate to war that we are agreeing to follow because the alternative is too costly. And it's like, that's the message that we should be focusing on, not the amount of watts it uses in comparison to clothes dryers. Okay. And so if you just focus on the socio-technical piece with this whole picture point of view, from kinetic power projection to electric power projection, from nuclear stalemate to now a new way of reestablishing zero trust and egalitarian control over a monetizable property that can't be oppressed as easily. This is so much more important than anything else that is happening and any discussion that is happening. Like, what could be more important than this if this is true? And that's what I want to leave people with. Just think about that seriously.
Well, that's fantastic, Jason. You've been incredibly generous with your time and sharing your knowledge. For those that would like to follow you on Twitter and other platforms, how could they do so?
My Twitter handle is at Jason P. Lowery. Lowery is how you say my last name. I'm not going to use it as much anymore. I might be more talkative on LinkedIn for the short term, but my goal is this, and my follow-up final conversation with Adam Back are going to be my last public appearances, and then I'm going to focus really hard on writing this thing because I think I've gotten to a point where I can build this grounded theory now. I've done all the theoretical sampling I need to do. I think it's ready to be written, which means I need to stop allowing myself to have so much fun on social media and really focus.
Excellent. Again, with really nothing back specifically to you, not a hedge fund manager or anything like that. You're really just very generous with your time and sharing some incredible knowledge. And one of my favorite interviews of all time, especially with me here in now early April, heading off to Bitcoin Miami 2022 with tens of thousands of people. This creates new insight for me. I'm really excited about it. My brief close is it's been a tremendous pleasure and an honor to have Jason on. I really, really enjoyed it and look forward one day when he's finished with a lot of the deep work that he's doing and how things could evolve in the coming years to definitely having him back. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles, the host of the Angelo Robles podcast, founder at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to families of great success. Check out our website, familyofficeassociation.com. I am rather active on social media, the usual, LinkedIn. Many of you know me more as Family Office or Family Office Channel on YouTube, also on Twitter, and I'm Angelo Robles Meta, that's META, on Instagram, where actually I'm quite active on a variety of different things. And yes, I do consult, as I noted, with families on creating a family office, on understanding crypto. And as I said, a very catchy title of Disaster Prep for the Super Rich / Billionaires. So have a chance to reach out. Email is angelo@familyofficeassociation.com. And again, Jason, thank you so much for your time. Look forward to our connection in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelo.